Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. This is Dan Lizette with the Podcast Digest. Thank you so much for joining me again this week, episode 41. My guest this week and I went the longest time that I ever have with a guest to date so far. It's a great episode, and I really think you'll enjoy it. But before we get to that, I wanted to take just a minute for a few quick show announcements. If you guys follow me on Twitter, and I hope that you do, at Pod Digest, there is some really cool stuff that I've recently done with the website, and that is the ability to take your show submissions. I have been deluged over the last 9 months or so with all kinds of recommendations. They could be Twitter DMs, emails, mentions, and it's great. In fact, a lot of the great shows I've featured here on the Podcast Digest have come from you pointing them out to me. Then I check them out and go from there. Well, I wanted to come up with a way to kind of consolidate all of this information and give me sort of one reference point. So I did that. On the website, thepodcastdigest.info, if you look on the right-hand side, you will see a link to a page that is for listener submissions. So if you know of a great podcast out there that you want me to take a look at, to start learning about, to get familiar with, and to potentially review or maybe even interview the host of that show, please go to that page, fill it out. It's a quick Google form, won't take you but a couple of minutes. Some basic information like the website, the name of the show, any Twitter handles for the hosts or the show, and it'd be greatly appreciated. I really want to make sure that your voice is heard on the Podcast Digest, so please let me know what you would like to hear. The other thing I want to mention to you guys, and also I mentioned this on Twitter, I realized as we are moving into June now, 2015, that the 1-year anniversary for the Podcast Digest is coming up very, very soon. September 1st of last year, 2014, I released episode 1. A lot has changed with the show length, the fact that I have guests, the production value, the sound quality, I hope, has all gotten better. And with that said, I want to come up with something for the 1-year show. I have no idea what to do. I've received a few good ideas, but please reach out to me on Twitter at Pod Digest or shoot me an email, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. Let me know what you'd like to hear. I'm kicking around, some massive recommendation show where I could highlight all kinds of stuff. Maybe a greatest hits, so to speak, of kind of looking back at some of the shows I've recommended and see what they've been doing since, or maybe some giant panel where I bring on, any number of hosts to kind of do a full blowout summary of the first year of the Podcast Digest. Really not sure, but I really want to hear from you and what your ideas are. So please, email, Twitter, all that fun stuff. In the meantime, let's get to this week's episode. It's one of my favorites so far. I really think you'll like it, especially if you're a fan of Apple or technology. Take care, folks, and enjoy. Folks, and this is episode 41 of the Podcast Digest, and I'm really excited to have my guest this week. My guest is someone that I've been a listener to for a very long time. You guys have heard me say in the past that I've been listening to podcasts since somewhere around 2008 or so, and one of the very first ones that I came across, being the Apple and technology fan that I am, was the MacCast. And the host of the MacCast, Adam Christianson, is my guest here this week. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dan. I appreciate the invite.
Well, it's great to have you. And as I mentioned, I've been listening to your work for a very long time, and it has been an amazing education for somebody like me that came to Apple products and the iPhone fairly late in the cycle. I think the 4 was my first one, and everything just kind of exploded from there, the first iPad and so on and so forth. And right around that time, I found your show and have been a listener since. But for the off chance that someone's listening to this and isn't familiar with you or the MacCast, give them a little synopsis of what you do.
So the MacCast is an Apple-focused technology podcast that I do about every week or so. There's a new episode, and what I try to do is cover the week's news. What I call it is news commentary. I'm not out reporting the news or finding the stories, but I'm summarizing the stories of the week, sort of the top Apple-focused stories of the week, and giving you my thoughts and opinions on that. And then I also do tech help. So the back half of the show is answering tech questions, providing tips and tricks. People will either email in comments or call in. We have a hotline people can call in on and leave a voicemail. And then I try and just answer people's Apple, Mac technology questions and help people out with their computers.
And I know you've helped me out in all kinds of things. I don't know how many times I've listened to an episode and hit pause, grabbed up a device, and given a shot something you've just described. That has happened on a number of occasions. I mentioned that somewhere around 2008, 2009, I became a listener, but that was not anywhere near your start. You are one of the originals, I would like to think, at least in the Apple technology realm. How long have you been doing this?
I've been doing it since pretty much podcasting started, which was 2004. I was a few months late to the party because I think it was in the fall, maybe late summer, when Adam Curry and those guys started first putting out what I think we would traditionally call a podcast. The first episode of MacCast aired December 13th, 2004.
That's amazing. And
10, we're going on the 11th year. I guess I'm in my 11th year. That's how you might put it. It's been 10 years of podcasting.
And if memory serves me, or I've understood from other podcasters that I've talked to who've had similar experience, this predated iTunes, correct?
Oh, yeah. We didn't get podcasting in iTunes. Oh, man, I'm going to not be able to remember the date for. It was for a couple years, I think. I mean, there was not a... when I did that first episode, there wasn't even a directory. I mean, there was no centralized place to even find podcasts at that point. You sort of just had to, search around the web and find the RSS feed. And there were some rudimentary, what you would call podcatchers or things to actually, read the feed and grab the enclosures, grab the files and sort of save them off into iTunes or something like that. So I think we did have iTunes, but we didn't have podcasting in iTunes. So yeah, you kind of had to cobble things together, as it were.
I've wondered, in you guys who got the start so early, I know for me, my show is only 41 episodes long. I started September 1st of last year. I know why I did it, because I was listening to so many great folks like yourself and some of the others that I've had the opportunity to talk to put out great stuff, and I wanted to kind of dip my toe in the pool. But for you guys way back at the beginning, what was, I don't know if motivation's the right word, or what's the thought process on kicking something like this off? What was kind of your driving force to begin?
Yeah. So mine was, I discovered podcasting, and a lot of the stuff that was out there in there, well, there wasn't a lot of stuff out there in the early days. I guess that's where I need to start. But Adam Curry had a show he was doing. There was Don and Drew, Dave Slesher. It was this great storytelling technology guy, had a podcast called Evil Genius Chronicles. So there's like this handful of shows out there that you could actually find and listen to. And I think what it was is I fell in love first with the concepts and the idea of podcasting. At the time I was commuting about an hour. I live in Southern California and San Diego. So, commuting is a common thing, spending a lot of time in the car. And, I never, I would listen to the radio, but I wasn't a big fan of the volume of advertising that you would get exposed to, say, on a morning drive show or something like that. And I sort of kind of discovered podcasts, and it was a great way to pass the time. And, it seemed a lot more personal than just sort of flipping on the radio and things like that. So I fell in love with the platform first. And then from there, because I was such an Apple and a Mac fan, I went out and thought, well, I really would love it if there was a show that could give me my Mac and Apple news. And being the early days of podcasting, there wasn't, because no one had done it yet. And so it spun from there, because I went, well, if I'm looking for this, then somebody else might be looking for this content. And I think it was Don and Drew who really inspired me, because they were doing this show from, like their farmhouse, and they had a little $25 USB microphone. So it was just USB microphone plugged into a Mac, recording in GarageBand. And when they described that setup, I went, well, I can spend $25 and I have GarageBand and I have a Mac. How hard could this be to do? So that's really what inspired the show, was like really me wanting to have a show to listen to. And I thought, well, if no one else is going to create it, or if it doesn't exist, maybe I can create it. And it just sort of took off from there. And I think what really made me want to continue to do it was I did my very first episode, put it out there. And like I said, remember, there's no centralized directory. I had no way to promote it. I hadn't told anybody about it. But that week, I got an email from somebody, and he asked an Apple question. And I was just doing news. The original show was supposed to be like 10 to 15 minutes, just sort of running down the news stories for the week, sort of doing a synopsis. Because my idea was I wanted this show where I wouldn't have to go and sit in front of my computer at work or at home and sort of go to all these Apple blogs and news sites and stuff like that to get that information. I'm like, I could get it in the car while I'm commuting, and that's going to save me time. So that was the first show. And then right from the get-go, I got this technology question, and I went, that's something I probably should add too, because I've always been really active in Apple user groups, which was the place that I would go to kind of get tech help and help with my Macs and Apple products and get questions answered. And so when I got that first question, it was sort of like, here's a way to kind of take that user group experience and expand it to, really the world. I mean, that was the other exciting thing about podcasting was, there was no rules, there's no FCC, there's no barriers. If you could get it on the internet, anybody could listen to it. So it was really just the passion for podcasting as a platform, I think that caused me to get into it.
So did you see then, in essence, a kind of 2004 version or kind of an amped up word of mouth, kind of a human social media? Because I imagine after you launched this, then you went back to the user group and said, hey guys, guess what I'm doing? And did that kind of become a thing where you were the guy who had the podcast, and then they started listening and kind of fed off each other back and forth?
Yeah. I think it was really grassroots in those early days. So a lot of the way podcasters early on, and if you go back and listen to any of those episodes, we traded around bumpers basically to promote each other's podcasts.
Right.
Was kind of how it went. So almost everybody at that time had a 10, 15 second sort of, hey, this is the MacCast and it's about this and that, and you should come subscribe to our thing. And we would all just agree to sort of play bumpers on each other's shows. So it was really within podcasting where it sort of got passed around, and that's how people found out about other shows and other content, at least in those early days.
And I have to know, because I think I was looking at your website, and I think I see it, and I think you even mentioned it not too long ago in an episode, but how many episodes of the MacCast have there been?
So I think I just recorded episode 525.
That is absolutely insane.
Right?
Which is
and then
right past 10 years.
526. And then I also have a premium, a paid members program, and I've done 188 episodes of that too. So it's really
over 700.
Yes. Yeah. And 780. Yeah, I can't do the math in my head right now.
And that doesn't
late in the day on Friday.
That doesn't even count other shows you've been on or guested on, or all of that isn't even
right. And I also there's several special episodes I used to do in the past that I didn't give episode numbers to. So there's probably even a few extra in there that I'm not counting. But it's a lot of content over 10 years.
It leads me to what I think is the most obvious question. A lot of my audience is fellow podcasters. Obviously, I review and recommend podcasts, so it's like moth to a flame. A lot of them have come and take a listen to the show and find other great stuff and ask for me to have them on and so forth. But I've got to know that number of episodes, this many years, what is it that you feel kind of keeps you going? Is it Apple itself, the community? What is it?
Yeah, it's definitely the community. No doubt about that whatsoever. And I think, again, getting back to, I don't know how many people in your audience would understand this, but if you've been in the sort of Apple community as long as I have, I mean, my first Apple was an Apple IIgs, back in the 80s, and I've been an Apple fan since then. A big part of the Apple world is the community. And you had these user groups, which would be, any given city you could go to and they'd probably have a Mac user group. Some still do. It's sort of a fading thing, unfortunately. It makes me sad. But the idea is here's where you would go and you would find like-minded people. Because, for example, my wife, is not into technology, and I'm obsessive about it. And, she puts up with me because she's an awesome person.
I can totally sympathize with you here, Adam, for the record.
Right? But so that was my outlet. This was a place I could go to, and I would find people who were just as passionate, maybe even more passionate in some cases, and I could totally geek out on this stuff. And it was a great community, and if you had trouble with your machine, they were there to help you out. It's like any other club or organization or something like that. So I guess that's the analogy. If anybody's been in a club or any organization, and I think most people have, you kind of get the idea, right? You have this great community and everybody kind of helps each other out, and it's awesome. And so, like I was saying earlier, when that very first episode went out and I immediately got that question from that, the person who found it, and I wish I could remember their name. I should go back and listen to the second episode to try and remember which person in the MacCast community that was and thank them. But it's that every week people tune in, and every week I get tons of email. Thank you so much for doing the show. You really helped me out with this, that, or the other. And that's such a rewarding feeling. So regardless of anything else, just the ability to share the stuff I love with a large group of people, and then have that come back in waves, and it's awesome. It just really is. And to be able to do that on a really truly international kind of global scale now it's just been amazing. So that's really what keeps me going.
So as time went on, did a feeling of, I don't know if the word responsibility works here, but I'll try that. In that, listenership was going up, more and more people are asking questions and grateful for the responses. Did it become almost like, wow, this is getting to be kind of a big deal. I need to make sure everything's accurate. I need to make sure I put an episode out. Did that start to amp up for you?
That always does amp up. And it's an interesting thing because I've had long debates with other podcasters about things like schedule and, getting episodes out. And, I've always felt a responsibility about doing that. The one thing that I think I did very early on, though, with the MacCast that's maybe benefited me is I've never had a set release schedule. So I don't have a set time when I put an episode out. And my audience knows sometimes it ends up being longer than I think they would wish, but I think a lot of them sort of understand how that goes. And they may or may not know this from my perspective, but like you're saying, you do get this sort of sense of responsibility, not only for just getting content out there, but in my case, I'm very concerned about the quality, specifically the quality of the content. Audio quality and all those other things are very important as well. But for me, the best shows that I do are when I'm sort of jazzed up and amped to do it, and also when I'm prepared and I've gotten all my prep done. So, we all live lives too, and you know how life goes. Sometimes life puts roadblocks into getting maybe my show prep done, or there's something happening and just emotionally I'm sort of spent for that day. So I kind of learned early on for myself that when I would try and, let that sense of responsibility take over and force myself to do a show when I wasn't either emotionally or actually, just prep-wise ready to do it, the quality level really suffered. And I wasn't happy with what I was putting out. So, at some point I just gave myself permission to say, look, it's okay if the show goes out a couple days late, if the quality of the show is, what you're going to be happy with. So that's kind of how I dealt with it. But, you still get anxiety. Even when I'm doing that, it's sometimes hard to let go and say, look, it's okay. And the community has been overwhelmingly supportive and awesome. Early on, it was funny. At one point, I was having a particularly bad, I don't know if it was a year, a couple months or something like that, but I'd come on and I would apologize for the show being late. Right. Hey, sorry, the show's late, this or that happened. And the overwhelming response from the community was, you know what, we don't care. Don't Don't apologize. Don't say thank you. Just go into the show and just do what you do. And that was really great to hear. I mean, that was an awesome thing to hear from the community because it's like they get it. And that's another great thing about podcasting, I think, is, people who are into podcasts or listen to podcasts, they do get it. They kind of get, that this is about, being passionate about a topic, but also, setting a certain bar for the type of quality of content that you're going to put out there too.
And I really love this perspective on things, Adam, because quite frankly, I've listened to a lot of podcasts about podcasts. I do so because I want to become better at doing this, and I want to learn as much as I possibly can. And one of the refrains you will hear constantly is consistency on release schedule, because you become part of people's routine and set an expectation, and when you don't deliver, that's when there could be an issue. But the story you're telling makes complete sense to me, and that your listenership has basically learned or learn to appreciate a level of quality that you deliver, and if it takes a little while to deliver that, that's okay. I think that's excellent.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I'm going to caveat that because, again, this is the conversation I've had with other podcasters. If you're coming new into podcasting, I think there is this idea of schedule. So I think because I have been doing it so long, I get away with some things that I think that other people, so I don't want to give the impression to someone who's a new podcaster that they can, jump in and just haphazardly release shows. The one thing I'm pretty adamant about is, I do get 4 episodes out a month.
Right.
Regardless of how I need to do that, I do make sure that I'm getting about 1 out a week. I just don't have a set release date. So there still is consistency. I don't want to give the idea that there's not this consistency.
Right.
You can't get to 526 episodes without consistently releasing shows. So it's just, I don't have a set release date, but there is always a show. There will always be within 7 to 10 days, and with very few exceptions. I've had longer periods. And sometimes if I'm going to be going on vacation or something like that, of course you could say, hey, there's not going to be a show next week. Right. I'm on vacation. People totally understand that. But yeah, 7 to 10 days, there's usually an episode in that feed.
And this transitions well into the next thing I wanted to mention to you, Adam, which was the production process, because by and large, you are a solo operation. And I know you do have guests, the Amigos Shows, which I want to talk about as well in just a little bit. But before I get into your production process, I want to get the elephant in the room out of here right now. And I want to talk about the enhanced podcasts, because you are one of the few in my queue that do it. And I've seen some recent things. I think you were on Twitter here just recently questioning that. So take me through the story. How did this come to be? Why did you choose to do it? Why have you stuck with it? And for anybody who doesn't know what this is, can you tell them what this is?
Yeah, so this is a great thing. It's kind of an Apple-only thing, so it's apropos for what I do and for my audience. I'm trying to remember. I need to go back and figure out. I need to just hardwire that date when Apple added podcasting to iTunes. So Apple has a file format called AAC, and I think it stands for Advanced Audio Codec, Advanced Audio Codec. Some people call it Apple Audio Codec. But part of that file format, and I've since learned, actually, apparently there's ways to do this with MP3 as well, but basically what Apple built into the spec when they brought podcasting to iTunes and to the iPod and stuff like that was the ability within that format to add some enhanced, what you'd call enhanced functionality or additional functionality beyond the audio. And specifically what they added was the ability to put in chapter markers. So you can go through the audio and you can set sort of break points or chapter points that when you're listening, you can automatically jump to those points. So if you're on an iPod or an iPhone or something like that, there's actually a menu and you can see those chapters. Within those chapters, you can also change the album artwork. So most people, if you listen to a podcast on MP3, there's usually like a piece of artwork that comes up. With enhanced podcasts, that artwork can change at certain breakpoints or at certain time codes. And you can have those at the chapter markers, or you can also just have them inserted at specific time code points. And then along with that as well, you can add in hyperlinks. So in my show, for example, if I'm talking about a particular topic or I refer to a URL or something like that, I can bake that into the enhanced audio file. And then podcatchers or podcast applications that can process that information and that file format can display that. And, it varies how different applications display that, but the data is there in the underlying file for them to be able to take advantage of that. And Apple very early on, obviously, because they sort of invented this thing, they supported it very well, especially on the iPods back in the day. Since then, their support for it, in my opinion, has felt like it's been sort of waning. And I think it's because the format never really I don't think took off in a huge way. There's just a handful of podcasts that I'm aware of that actually put out an enhanced AAC version of their audio file. And for me, it's a little extra work because I actually put out an AAC version. There is also just a pure MP3 version of my show, again, because, say, on Android or some other platforms, they may or may not support the AAC audio format.
And you have been reconsidering this kind of dual production process lately?
Well, yeah, only because, again, Apple, there's been some bugs in some of the latest versions, specifically of Apple's podcasting application, and they don't seem to be getting much attention in terms of fixing it. And so it's kind of caused me to question, are they really going to continue to support the audio format going forward? I will tell you, my audience overwhelmingly prefers the enhanced format. And anytime I talk about this, I get massive feedback in the please, I love this format because it gives the added advantage. I mean, you were mentioning earlier that you pause the podcast to go back and maybe go through a tip or something like that. What's great about having the chapters in there is you could also just that episode, Adam talked about that tip. You can come back to it later because you can come back and you can just pull down that chapter marker and jump right to that section of the podcast. Or I know some people who they say, I get my Apple News from someone else. Ken Ray, macOS Ken, does a daily Mac news podcast. He's a good friend of mine. He's actually one of the Amigos that we'll talk about a little bit later. Right. People like to get the news from him, and a lot of the stories are the same. So they say, I just skip over the news part and I just jump right straight to the tips and tricks and feedback stuff, and that's great too. So, and not having those chapters would make it a little bit more difficult for them to just kind of get to the content they want to get to. So I want to continue to use them. The latest rant I will fill you and your audience in. I keep forgetting that there's this one bug. So I mentioned that you can put in different album art.
Right.
There is this weird bug, and it's been around there for a long time, that if the piece of artwork is larger than 200 megabytes, I think, the podcast application starts to freak out sometimes. And so what was happening specifically to me was I had a couple people who were like, I can't listen to your show. Right. I'm trying to download it, and it shows it's playing. It would show it was playing in the timeline, but no audio would come out of the audio player. Yet you could take that same file and you could open it up on my website in the streaming player and it would play fine. Or you could open it up in another application that wasn't Apple's podcast application, say Downcast or Instacast, something like that, and it would play fine there. And even for some people in the podcast app, it would download and play fine. So there are these real flaky bugs. And for me, it gets very frustrating because I hate to think, I was mentioning how I'm big about the quality. I hate to think that I'm putting something out there that not everybody can actually consume. And so it really frustrates me. So, in this case, it was somewhat my fault because I had forgotten about this bug. And I had put in some album art that I hadn't used before, and I didn't kind of pay attention to the file size. So, but by the same token, that's why I'm saying I kind of question this bug's been there for a really long time. Apple is aware of the bug and has been aware of the bug for a really long time, and they haven't fixed it yet. So it kind of makes me wonder, are they really behind the AAC enhanced format anymore or not? And if they're not, maybe it's just time to move on and let it go. So that's where I've been at with it.
While it's still here, I know I listen to your show, and I've been a Pocket Cast user for years. I've loved that application for a long time, and really enjoyed it. And as far as I can tell, it handles the AAC just fine. I see the changing album artwork, and there's the chapter markers that appears on the menu. What application, in your experience, you probably know better than anyone, have you heard works the best for that?
I liked Downcast for a while. I personally switched back to Apple's podcast app. I know it got a lot of flack early on. I think Apple's made it a lot better. It generally does. Again, if I remember things like the album art thing, it generally does pretty well, even with the AAC format. But it really comes down to the developer, and if the developer is aware of AAC, and then there's limitations as well, because I really like Overcast, Marco Armand's podcatcher, but I think it's not supporting AAC at all,
right.
As far as I can remember. And if it is now and he's pushed out an update, I apologize to him right now, but I don't believe that it does. And some people care, some people don't care. So I don't know. I like the features, and I want to continue to keep supporting them as long as I can. And but yeah, as far as which podcast player is the best, there's such great ones out there. I mean, Pocket Cast is great, Downcast is great, Instacast is great, Marco's Overcast is great. So it's great we have a lot of choices, because in the early days we didn't really have that.
Isn't that, I mean, and I am obviously a junkie. I mean, for starting this show with the topic matter I have, I've literally bought them all. I swear, I've bought them all and tried them all, from, Castro to all the ones you mentioned.
Castro's a good one too.
And for some reason, and I've tried to switch off, but I keep landing back on Pocket Casts, and I'm not 100% sure why, but it just seems to work the best for me. And I think that, like so many other things, whether it be browsers or messaging apps or even devices, tends to be such a unique personal choice. And that,
it's a personal choice. It just comes down to what features do you like, and what kind of clicks with you, and how the UI is laid out.
Mm-hmm.
Those sorts of things. Where you listen can make a big difference too.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. The production process, though, outside of this AAC experience, I've always assumed that I've heard Tom Merritt on Daily Tech News Show talk about his kind of daily workflow. I think he was on Mac Power Users a few months back, talking about his kind of ebb and flow to be able to assemble all these stories and deliver them. Kind of take us through what your week looks like, because it seems so chock full of information. What does this look like to be able to put out an episode of the MacCast?
Right. So the bulk of putting out an episode for the MacCast involves, parsing through a lot of content and distilling it down into an outline. So, there's probably a million ways to do this. I'll tell you the tools that I do, though. So I rely very heavily on RSS feeds for the news stuff. So I'm just looking at my feed right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, about 18 to 20 Apple Mac news sites that I monitor and follow via RSS. I use various applications depending upon what I'm on the Mac. I use an application called ReadKit. On my iPhone, I think I use an application called Newsify, and on my iPad, I use one called Mr. Reader. And they're all synced up through an RSS service called Feedly.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So all my feeds go into Feedly, and then I plug, whatever the appropriate application is into that. And so then the process goes, I do a pretty much daily, I'm going through the news articles, probably multiple times a day, really, if I think about it. And what I'm doing is I'm going through the news stories, because there's probably, depending upon what's happening in the Apple News, 100 to 300 articles a day that I have to get through. And so it's a first pass where I'll just sweep through and look for specific headlines that I want to cover. And what I do is I flag those. So with the RSS reader, you have the ability to star them. And so I sort of put them off into a folder, basically, that is, okay, here's the main bulk stories that I want to cover this week. And then as it gets closer to the time when I'm going to record the show, usually the day before, what I'll do is I'll sit down and I'll go into that folder, and then I'll start to create my show notes. And basically what I use for that is I use Omni Outliner Pro.
Right.
And that works both on my iPad or my Mac. And they have a sync system, so it syncs up through there. And so the key there is that I like to be able to sort of parse through my stories, read anything, and take notes whenever I have time. So if I'm out with just my iPad, I can kind of go through some articles. I can add some notes. And the way I take my notes and do my show is I just do a bulleted outline. So I'll have kind of a main topic. So I could probably give you an example if I'm looking through this week. Some like this week's news stories. There's a lot of talk about Johnny Ive just got a new title at Apple. He's now got a promotion to Chief Design Officer. So I have a bunch of stories related to that. So I'll parse through that, and so that'll be one subject headline. And I really like to use multiple sources because I think part of the value of the show is to bring you get different perspectives from different sources. So I like to try and make sure that I get the full story, because one site might cover one angle and another one might cover another angle. And sometimes, you have varying opinions and stuff like that. So I try and keep it very balanced. And I think that helps do that. So it's pretty much parsing through the articles, getting that in. And then I do the same thing with, basically the same thing with my email. I have a folder called Next Episode of the MacCast. So people will call or email in. I'll take emails of questions that I might want to cover for the next episode. Those get put into that folder. And then, this day before, when I'm prepping the show notes, I'm going to go through those folders. I'm going to pull out any audio comments that I want to cover, put those into sort of the production folder for that show recording, and, add bullet points into my notes. And also in my notes are going to be any of those links and things that I'll use for the enhanced podcast, that sort of stuff. So I sort of do all the assembly right leading up to the day that I record. And then I don't know, do you want me to go into recording or, so that's sort of the prep part. I don't know how you want to break this up.
Well, sure. Well, before we get into the recording itself, and I don't want to get into too much detail. I don't want to get overly technical for folks, but do you kind of then do sort of a last pass of the information, right? Has anything been updated? Have there been, new update? There's a last pass before you record, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, again, every day I'm going through the articles and stuff like that. So if there's been an update to an article or something like that, I'll pick that up and I'll update the show notes. Yeah, so I'm updating the show notes right up to recording time. Right before I sit to record, I'll make sure that the Feedly feed, everything's been read, looked through, or at least parsed through, and then the appropriate articles have been read through. Yeah.
And just to give folks an idea, this research and outline assembly, if you had to put an hour number on it a week on average, what are we looking at here?
Probably 20 to 30 hours a week for that part of it.
That is amazing. That really is. And that's it's a credit to the standing you now have, I think, in the Apple community, because people know that that's what's going into what's coming into their earbuds each week.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is a passionate community, so I learned very early on, you have to be, accuracy is key. I mean, you will get called out on stuff, and it's great. It's actually part of the thing that I love it is if I do make a mistake, the community has my back. And what's great about podcasting is there's always a next episode. So I have an opportunity to, make a correction or say, hey, look, I messed this up or I misunderstood this. And it was clarified. So, I mean, you got cool stuff like that going on.
And I want to go back and talk about the time, but before we do, give people just a quick rundown of some of the hardware software you're using to produce the show each week.
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, in the early days, it was a USB mic and GarageBand. The GarageBand part of it hasn't changed. I still use GarageBand, and it's funny because I have peers in this community that are like, "You haven't moved on to more Pro tools," but I don't think that it's really necessary. GarageBand does a really great job for me, and I've been very, very happy with it. About the only downside, again, and this goes back to the conversation from earlier, the AAC thing. So part of the reason I do the AAC as well is GarageBand had what's called a podcast track in it. In the version, I think it's 9, GarageBand 11. With the latest version, they've removed that. Yes. So that was another key indicator to me saying that, maybe Apple isn't going to continue to support this enhanced podcast thing because they took it's a big production tool for me. Luckily, GarageBand, the older version still runs on OS X Yosemite. So I'll continue to use that.
Yeah, I had a similar experience because when I first started this, and doing my research as getting to launch, I wanted to use GarageBand. I had started with a MacBook Air before I ended up with the Mac Mini I'm using now, but I wanted to use GarageBand, and I'd already updated the machine. And I'm looking at these YouTube videos and reading these articles, and I'm like, I don't see anything in here about podcasting. What's going on? And I was completely confused as a newbie.
Yeah, so they took some of the podcasting features out. I keep hoping they're going to come back, but we haven't seen it yet. So software for recording is GarageBand. The only other thing I use for recording is if I'm doing a Skype interview, I use Audio Hijack Pro. And I'm trying to move over to Audio Hijack, but I'm having some issues, and that's just with my setup. It's still great software, but Audio Hijack or Audio Hijack Pro from Rogue Amoeba. And so that's for just recording the audio part. On the actual hardware side, so I did upgrade from that simple $25 USB microphone. I don't recommend starting there. There's some great USB studio mics and dynamic mics you can get now that are perfect for podcasting. But I'm talking about a Logitech little thing you'd use for video gaming or something like that, or just doing Skype calls with your grandmother or something like that. But no, upgraded. So now I use for my mic, it's an Audio-Technica AT2020, and that's a studio condenser XLR mic. I run that into a mic preamp processor unit. It's called a DBX 286A. And for people who don't know this equipment, and I'm not an audio guy, the whole reason I have that little piece of equipment is I don't have a recording studio. I didn't build up a recording studio when I started. I was recording in a spare bedroom, and I kind of had some room noise and some hum. And I was talking to somebody I did know who was into the audio stuff, and they recommended the unit because it has one of the processing elements it has on it is what's called a noise gate, which basically is just a fancy thing that takes any low-level noise and just cuts it out of the audio. So anything below a certain decibel level sort of gets cut out. So if you have an air conditioner hum or something like that going on in the background. So that was the main reason I got it. But then it had some other things in it, like has what's called a de-esser, which helps de-emphasize sort of some of the harsher sounds in the audio. So, and it has a compressor limiter and some of these other things. So I bought that, and it wasn't too expensive. It was about $200. They have a newer version now, so I have an older one. But so I have that, and then all of that runs into just a Zoom H4n handy recorder, and really I'm just using that for doing, because all of my equipment is analog, so it's doing the analog to digital conversion. So it gives me a USB audio input, and that's what I capture and pull into GarageBand.
Great. There's a couple pieces there I wasn't familiar with, so that's good information for anyone who is looking to kind of up their setup or maybe just get set up from the beginning.
Yeah, it's probably more equipment than most people need. Like I said, right. I mean, I started 10 years ago, and I probably got this equipment, 5-6 years ago, this current setup, and I really haven't changed it. Now if I was starting out, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of great mics where I could probably just buy a mic, USB mic, plug in, and you would be hard pressed to tell the difference. A lot of the stuff that DBX is doing, you can do in software, and like GarageBand has stuff for it, or if you're using Audacity or I forget the name of the software that Audition that Adobe makes. Yeah, Adobe Audition. You can do all the same sorts of effects and sort of sweetening of the audio in software as well.
Yeah, I think my first 20 episodes were on the USB Blue Yeti, and I loved it.
That's a great mic. Yeah,
I loved it. And but I brought in the mixer and all these other things and went XLR from there.
That's usually what happens when you start getting into this. But start small and build up, and over time, then you'll end up with kind of all this gear.
You end up with I bought second monitor, Mac Mini, a desk. I mean, I didn't have any of this stuff, and kind of just went from there. But it's fun. It's fun. Yeah, that's for sure. So let's get back to the MacCast. We alluded to it just a little bit ago, and you mentioned early on about other kind of special episodes or different type of shows that you've done. And I mentioned that by and large, this has been a solo production for you, but not always. You have had guests, and fairly regularly. I love the name, the Amigos Shows. So tell folks if they start subscribing to the show and they start to see something like that come in, what are they getting with those episodes?
Yeah, so like you said, my show, and again, this comes out of having done it so long. When I started, there wasn't other podcasters to actually do podcasts with. And I would probably really recommend anybody starting out. I mean, it takes a lot to do a solo podcast, to sit in front of your mic by yourself and, just present content, and not have anybody to sort of play off of. It gets it's difficult. And I really had to kind of work my way and learn how to be able to do that. And so every once in a while, I want to have some other people on the show. And luckily, since I started, there's been a ton of great Mac podcasters that have joined the scene, and a couple of them I invite on, and we do this thing called the Amigos Shows. And for me, it started out, it was Ken Ray from macOS Ken, Victor Cajiao, who used to do a show called Typical Mac User, and myself. It was the sort of the three of us. Victor stepped out of podcasting for a while, and then at that time we brought in David Sparks from Mac Power Users. And David is great because he lives not far from me up in LA. So what we do is, it's the same kind of thing, sort of news commentary. We kind of cover some of the latest stories, but you get a little more perspective than just my opinion in perspective. So it's just nice every once in a while to have a couple extra voices on the show. It's also nice for me because I mentioned, sort of the amount of prep that has to go in. When I do one of those sorts of shows, because I'm reading the news anyway, there's a lot less prep that goes into it. So sometimes I'll kind of set one of those up if I know that I'm going to have a particularly hard week, or if I'm going on vacation or need to sort of fill in. So the behind the scenes information for that for your audience is, it's a great way to kind of get some content in the can. If I know that I'm not going to be able to get an episode out, or I'm going to have trouble getting an episode out in a given week.
Absolutely, and it's great content. I know macOS Ken and Mac Power Users are two other subscriptions I've long since had, almost as long as the MacCast. I'm not as familiar with Victor's work. I know he was the most recent one. That was just the two of you, and it was another excellent episode I enjoyed as well. I'm just not as familiar with his back catalog, if you will, as I am the other two.
Yeah, like I said, he had a great show called Typical Mac User. He was a Windows. He actually started out podcasting as a typical PC user, I think was his original show.
And switched it.
And then he started listening to my show, and this is sort of how we became friends. He was part of my community, and he switched over, and then became Typical Mac User. And then we met at a couple podcast conferences, and we've since become long friends. Victor's also close by, just up in, north of me a little bit. So
excellent.
Dave, Victor, and I get together. We have what we call our geek dinners or something like that every once in a while, about once a quarter or something like that. Get to hang out and sort of geek out. So that's always fun.
And anybody familiar with David Sparks knows, especially as they've made the move to Relay now, he's had recent news, which is related to something you mentioned to me as well, and that is now he is doing more focusing on his podcasts and his other, he does the books and the screencasts, and David Sparks does a lot of different things. But you are a full-time podcaster, correct?
Yeah.
How did that
come about? Been doing that for 5 or 6 years.
What was that like?
How did that come about? It came about from, if you get into podcasting and you're like us and you're really sort of passionate about it, you immediately have a desire like, I'd really like to do this full time. And for me, I mentioned the amount of prep that it takes to do a show. You can imagine I was doing that kind of prep, and having a 9-to-5 job that was like killing me.
Yeah. Who's my wife again? Who's my wife?
Literally. Yeah. It gets really difficult, but I still love doing it. I did that for many, many years, but it just meant I hardly ever slept. And then, if you're like me as well and you're getting older, sleep suddenly becomes more important. It seemed like when I was a lot younger, I could do that, right, but it started to get harder and harder on my body. But really, no, it was just like, hey, I really like doing this, and I want to do, as far as work goes, I want to do what I really love to do. So, but I don't know that I necessarily made a plan. I think what happened is I did make a plan early on when I decided, I do want to see if I can turn this into a career. I made a conscious plan on how I wanted to do monetization, and I kind of knew advertising was the way that I wanted to go. I didn't want to immediately go to a premium sort of thing or a paywall.
Right.
And I decided to sort of actively seek out somebody to help me with the advertising, because I realized too, and I think this was probably the smartest thing that I ever did, was I probably could have gone out and solicited sponsors. A lot of the people that I now have sponsors with that I have sponsorship with, I actually know. I mean, I've known from Mac conferences and things like that. These are people in the Mac community, but I knew also that I was already doing all the production work. I was doing all the prep work. I was like doing the business work. I have to take care of the taxes and all that sort of stuff. I knew that sort of ad sales wasn't another hat that I wanted to wear.
Right.
And I just didn't feel I could do it all that well. So I spent a good year sort of actively talking to and looking at my options in terms of a partner to help me with the advertising stuff. And what was critically important to me was I wanted to find somebody who was actually going to sell ads and rep the MacCast as the MacCast, but also, and the reason I wanted that was because I feel with podcasting, it's really important to match the sponsors to the audience. Right. And I wanted to make sure that I had a partner in that was going to be open, receptive, and sensitive to that. And I really lucked out. I'm with a company called Backbeat Media, and they do an awesome job, and they sort of get my market and the people that I'm trying to target. So it's worked out really well. And I guess the genesis to, or the getting to being able to do it full time was really setting up that partnership and then having that be successful. And I think it was successful because I did kind of have an active plan. I didn't make a business plan or anything like that, but I kind of knew what I wanted, and I knew how I wanted it to work. And I believed, I know now that, it worked out, but I believed that doing that would lead to the most success with the sort of advertising program. And that did work out. I mean, that panned out. So that's what it really enabled it.
That's great. That's gives hope to a lot of us newer folks in the industry that, the path is possible, although not easy. Like you said, it takes a lot of time and effort and work to be able to put together. The first thing you have to do is put out something that's quality, and then
right.
All the other steps follow from there. But
yeah, the one thing that I want to say on that end, though, is, and it's something that has concerned me about the industry currently, because we are growing. There's, I think, some compromises and things being made that concern me a little bit. Again, because I think really specifically, and I'm specifically talking about with an ad-supported model, I really do think it's very important to match the advertisers to the audience, but also on the other side of it, to get advertisers to recognize and pay for the value of that relationship that's being set up. And I do occasionally see things happening in the industry where that ideal is being compromised a little bit, and that does concern me from time to time. So
a delusion, basically. Things would get diluted if folks are accepting targeted, non-ideal sponsors, or the reverse.
Yeah, because people get passionate, and I've struggled with this myself. I've had to look at a deal that's sitting on the table that's a lot of money. It's like that. I would love to have that money in my bank account, right? But then look at it and go, but this is such not a right fit for my audience, or this is not a product that I feel I can really sit behind. But you got the money sitting on the table, right. And especially if you're, and I did this in the early days. I turned down a really big deal with an advertiser because they didn't have, it was a software company and they didn't have Mac software.
Right.
And I just said, this isn't right for my audience. And the business partner that was sort of setting that up for me at the time said, but look at how much money you're turning away. And I really felt like it was so important that I stuck to that ideal. But it was hard because it hurt. And so, I think it's very easy if you're on the other side of it and you're a podcaster and you're starting out and you're like, I really want to do this for a living and here's a way to do it. you might be tempted to sort of compromise that ideal. And I don't think that people want to. I think that they do it because, hey, here, I can make money from podcasting. But I think in the long run, that just sort of hurts everybody. I think it hurts the advertiser just as much. And that's sort of what I went back to this guy that I was dealing with. I said, really, the advertiser shouldn't want to advertise on my show. They shouldn't want to give me that money because they're not going to get the value out of it. And the problem is if I do this and take their money and then they don't get the value back, they're going to come back and say, well, podcasting just doesn't work. Advertising on podcasting doesn't work. Because we tried it and we didn't get any traction. And so that's a concern to me.
I'm sorry. Where do you fall, Adam, with this perspective on what I call non-traditional product advertising on podcasts? So I know the guys in ATP have talked about this at length, and now we see Ford advertising with Gimlet. So what about the Harrys and the the different what is it, Blue Apron that I've heard a lot as well. So,
I've heard some of those.
Yeah. So what about that? And the argument I think that I've heard in defense is we have a discerning audience with a certain level of taste, so thus this product is good to be advertised. Is that a camp you fall in, or do you feel like a lot of that is kind of misguided?
Yeah, I hopefully I'm not giving the impression like I'm saying, oh, well, it has to be, I'm only going to do Mac products or something like that, because I don't. Anybody who's listened to my show knows I've had advertisers that are on a broader scale, and those things make sense. I think again, if it gets into a tricky area, because I have had advertisers on the show where I've used and I believe in the product, and when I do that, I'm fully willing to say that within the ad spot and give an endorsement. I've also had some on where I think, there's going to be people in the audience that are going to like this product. I haven't tried or used the product. And in those cases, what I'll usually do is I'll just do, a read or something like that. And that's okay too. Again, I'm filtering it on, does this make sense for my audience? If somebody came to me, and I hate to keep coming back to this example, but it's the one that comes up the most frequently. Someone comes to me and it's, an Android only product or something like that. There's no way I can sell that,
right.
Whether I can try it or not, and even that line is a little bit gray, because they will come back and argue, well, some of your people in your audience probably use Android products, and it's true.
Right.
I know people who use Macs and they use Android as their phone, and it works great and stuff like that. I just don't think it gives the most bang for the buck for the advertiser. And again, my goal is to make sure that within advertising, within podcasting, we're bringing up people's ability to sort of, earn a living from it. And a lot of shows aren't going to have the numbers. So the trap that we get into is a lot of the advertisers are coming from it having been familiar with things like radio. And in radio, it's all about these huge numbers, right? It's like millions of listeners. Well, you might have a show that maybe only has a few thousand or 10,000 listeners. But I think the conversion rate, if you can make the right match, is going to be extremely higher. And I mean, there's been studies to prove this. I don't have, numbers in front of me right now, but I mean, you can go out and look at the research and you can see, if you can really target the right audience, your conversion rates and your response rates go up astronomically. The thing is oftentimes advertisers, because they're coming from those more traditional medias, they don't want to pay for that benefit.
They're just seeing the numbers and not necessarily the demographics.
Yeah, and they're not used to it, and they kind of have to feel it out for a while. So there's a lot of that going on right now too. I mean, really, this whole advertising thing in podcasting, where it's sort of growing, we're just starting to get to that point. We've struggled for a long, long time to even get people to come into the platform. So getting back to your original question, asking about some of these other companies that are coming in, I love it. I think a lot of them are good fits for very broad ranges of audiences. They're, innovative technology companies, or maybe not even technology companies. They're innovative companies that are using technology to sort of disrupt whatever market they might be in. So, you can look at a company like, say, Casper, who's doing the mattress thing, or NatureBox, who's got the snack thing going on. I think those are good fits for a lot of people. And a lot of people that are listening to podcasts are, in a certain demographic that I do think fit those businesses very well. So I think those are good fits.
And I think a lot of,
and I don't know if that's what you're asking.
No, absolutely,
about.
And that exactly. I'm just curious your thoughts on that, mostly because exactly like you said, I've heard diversity in a lot of the MacCast sponsors, and I was just curious how you were looking at that as a good fit or something that's kind of an evolution of the advertising and podcasting world.
Right. I mean, another challenge is, there's the whole pay for conversion thing versus pay for what we would traditionally call like pay for listen or whatever.
Right.
So there's a whole debate. We probably could do a whole show on advertising.
I know. I was just thinking there's so much here.
Mired down.
I think I've opened
mired down in podcast advertising stuff.
Well,
but
I can tell you that at least to some degree it's working. I've ordered Harry's before. I am in the market for a new bed. I've been on Casper's website a few times. Now they're appearing on all the websites thanks to Google and Amazon. Putting the ads in there, and I can tell you,
they've done a great job with their marketing.
I've looked at any number of products I've heard from podcasts, and those are just to name a few. And I'll tell you what, Adam, I could go on for I've got about 6 other podcast-related topics here I wanted to talk to you about, but I want to be respectful of your time. But before I let you go, I would not be doing my last 5-year self justice if I didn't steal a few minutes to ask you about some Apple topics, if that's cool with you.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Cool. All right.
And I mean, if you need a little bit more time, we can go a little bit more.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I did this, and I'm not sure if you had a chance to hear the episode, but one of the other big Apple folks I've talked to, I talked with Jason Snell, and I did this to him as well at the end of our conversation. So
great.
I wanted to give you the same treatment.
Hit me.
Okay. So these are kind of broad because I kind of wanted them to have some evergreen. That could have been a whole other topic, right? In terms of shows
yes.
and their relativity down the road and what have you. But Apple today, and for anyone listening to now, we're recording on May 29th, 2015. I'm not sure there are many people who know it, as good as you. What would you consider Apple's biggest strength today, and conversely, maybe its biggest blind spot or weakness?
Oh, wow.
Big question.
Big question,
so
yeah.
You could go
Apple's,
a product.
Apple's
you could go
biggest
a
strength, I think, Apple's biggest strength, I think, is the same thing that it's always been, and I think it's caring about the quality and the experience that they're delivering to their consumers. And that's not to say that they always meet that expectation that they have. But I think it's that striving to, make sure that the product and the whole product experience, from, the quality of materials that go into a build or the quality of the software all the way through the customer service and support, is just as good as it possibly can be. And really caring about that, I think, more than, I don't want to say more than, because this is another trap that I think a lot of my peers get into, is that you'll say, Apple cares about that first and foremost, more than making a buck. And I don't necessarily buy that. Right. I think a lot of times, decisions they make are still motivated by, the bottom line. They have shareholders to answer to. But I think overwhelmingly, really, they do. I really do believe that they care about the quality of the products that they're putting out into the world and making sure that, those really have an impact and change things. As far as their weakness, I think their weakness is the same weakness that most companies have, is that sometimes the strive to make a buck can maybe conflict with that overwhelming, first ideal.
On a lot of the recent products, there's been so much conversation in the last couple of years as what is perceived, and I think most people would agree is a real phenomenon that's happening with a lot of Apple's products and services, be it, Mac Pros, be it, the new Mac One, as Marco likes to call it, or even the Photos app, which is kind of this consumerization of a lot of the hardware and software, sort of taking away a lot of the pro or power user type features. What's your thought on that? Have you ever run afoul of this? Has any of these moves really kind of irked you, or have you found problems in new purchases, or what are your thoughts in general on this?
No, I've always kind of lived on the consumer side. It's a tough thing being in the Apple community, because what you're talking about is the what I would call the Apple faithful, the guys, those of us who stuck with Apple through the bad years in the 90s and clung on to the platform and sort of propped it up and kept it going. The real diehards, and those are what you would probably call the pro users. I was in graphic design and printing and pre-press when I was in my early days, and that's the community that propped it up, or the pro photographers, the real high-end pro photographers, or the pro video guys and things like that. The thing is over the past, decade and a half, Apple's market has really changed with the iPod and the iPhone and then the iPad. The overwhelming majority of their audience is in that consumer space. And this is that thing where, as I was saying earlier, and maybe it's not a weakness. It's sort of Apple recognizing that this is where the money is, and sometimes we need to follow where the money is and where we're going to have the most impact. So the sort of shift towards consumer things, I understand it from Apple's business standpoint, and I do think that irks the pro users, because they're going, well, what about us? I mean, we were your core market, and now you're abandoning your core market. And I think Apple's response back is, well, the core market is, 5% of the business, and 95% of the business is this other place. So it hurts, and it's rough, but at the same time, it's one of those business decisions that I guess I understand. I don't like it. I'm in that same camp. I don't necessarily like it or think it's the greatest thing to do, but Apple has to keep moving forward, and they've always been a forward-only thinking company. They sort of only look forward; they don't look back too much.
Right, and I got one more Apple thing I want to hit you with, and if the previous couple were big, this is bigger and unfair and almost impossible to answer. But it was actually driven by something that a couple months back, Mike Hurley was talking about on one of his podcasts, and he mentioned that, I believe this was right after either Tim Cook came out, or he wrote a couple of the articles are taking the stands on some of the equal rights stances, and he came out and said that, you know what? He says, I'm going to say it. He says, I like Tim Cook's Apple better than what Steve Jobs' Apple was. And I'm just sort of curious of your opinion. Do you think that, obviously giving all deference to kind of, the company's creation and all the amazing things Steve Jobs did back then, but do you think kind of, be it the charity given or the humanity causes or what have you, that kind of Apple is in a better overall place than prior?
Yeah, that is a tough question. No, I'm only sighing because I did a show right when Tim Cook sort of started taking over Apple. When the transition was happening after Steve died, and the media was being hypercritical of Tim and not believing that Tim could sort of live up to the legacy of Steve. And my take, even back at that time, was it's going to be a different Apple, and we need to let Tim Cook be Tim Cook, and it needs to be Tim Cook's Apple. And even Steve had sort of given the blessing and told him exactly the same thing. And so I don't necessarily think it's fair to even draw a comparison. So that's why I'm somewhat having a hard time with the question, because they're really two different men, and I think both versions of Apple are amazing and great in their own unique ways. And so I think the most positive thing. So I'd almost answer it like I think Tim Cook's Apple is not better. Philosophically, I think it fits better with some of the things that I like to see happening. I like the humanitarian efforts. I like Apple being more open about their environmental efforts and the things that they're trying to do. The thing is a lot of people don't know, a lot of those things were implemented and initiated under Steve. It's just Steve didn't talk about those things. They were very private about, sort of the things that they did. Apple always had a big presence in education and supporting education and giving back to schools and giving, computers and technology to schools and things like that. So you could probably go back in history and draw a lot of examples. It's just it wasn't marketed or promoted. So under Tim, he's more open about marketing and promoting those sorts of things. And so then the other question you're left with is, well, what about innovation? Is Apple going to be as innovative under Tim Cook as Steve Jobs? And I think so far, I'm pretty happy with how it's going. A lot of people have been very critical of that, but again, people lose track of history, and I don't think they realize timelines between, sort of launching huge revolutionary products. And the other thing people forget is that a lot of the products toward the end of Steve Jobs' tenure that were really released under Tim, because Steve was so sick at the time. So he doesn't get a lot of credit for really being the guy behind those product launches when he really was. So I don't know. I think they're different apples. I think both versions of Apple are amazing, and I'm always looking forward to sort of seeing what's next.
Excellent. One last quick question, because I do want to wrap this up, and I want to, because literally I could go for hours, Adam. I really could. The Apple Watch is probably one of the only recent item releases, meaning versions of iPhones, iPads, whatever the case may be, that I did not get on release day, and I still don't have it as I'm looking down at my Pebble. Can you give me a really good reason why I should have one so I can play this back for my wife?
Really good.
Give me a reason I must have this.
I'm going to disappoint you. I'm going to disappoint you.
It's not a must-have, is it?
I think it will be. And I know that sounds almost like a cop-out, but it's this device that, in many ways, it's like the iPad, though. I don't know that the iPad was necessarily a must-have product for people who already had an iPhone. But what the iPad did, and what I think the Apple Watch is going to do, is it slowly sort of works its way into parts of your life to the point where it becomes a vital element. Not a vital, but it becomes that element. Like, you use it in a different way. It fills little nooks and crannies in your digital life that you didn't know needed filling.
It's worth
but then once you have it, though, if you take it away, you realize, now there's a hole there. I didn't know I had that hole before, but now that the hole has been filled, it definitely is a hole. So for me, and it's going to be unique and personal for everyone. Again, and this was another thing that I think the iPad really illustrated was, if you walk up to anybody who has an iPad and ask them how they use it, you're going to get very, very different answers. Right. Even if they're doing similar sorts of tasks, the real nitty gritty of how they use it. So, it depends on how you run your life and how you run your day and stuff like that. So with the Apple Watch, for me, some of the killer features are just being able to get the notifications. And you mentioned already having a Pebble there. Pebble fulfills that role. And I had a Pebble before this, and it did it. The watch just does that part of it better, because you have actionable notifications, so you can actually respond to things, unlike with the Pebble where it's purely informational. So it adds to that experience. Killer feature for me is I work at home, and I have a home office, and I will get up and walk in the kitchen to get coffee or something like that. I might get a notification or an email or specifically a phone call, and it's several times I've been able to pick up a phone call and get a question answered or something like that. Or Siri, when I'm I've stepped away from my phone, the ability to use that sort of thing. So these are little, not earth-shattering, life-changing things. But when you sort of put them all together, they add up to, a pretty great enhanced experience that you're going to have with your technology. It really is an accessory for the phone. It's kind of an expensive one, so it's hard to justify, right off the bat. But I think once you have one and own one, like I said, it works its way into your life, and then you sort of won't be able to live without it. But do you have to run out and get it on day one? No, and there's something to be said, even potential benefit to say, version 2 is going to be even that much better. So if you don't want to spend the cash out now, a few months down the road, they're going to announce a new one. And in the fall, I'm sure we're going to have, or spring, early next year, we'll have a new one. So,
and that was a story that I gave my wife. So I had I think I got my Pebble just, only in, the last 6 months. And so the idea of saying, well, what do you need another watch for? So I started banging the version 2 drum from the get-go. So I figured that'll be like
there you go. You'll be ready. You'll be ready to go.
Banging, so
yeah, and the Pebble with their latest software updates and stuff has been really great. I was really enjoying my Pebble toward the end. Early on it was a bit rough, but it's become a really nice product.
I'm good with it, with the exception of the connection dropping. I'm one of those. Yeah. It really is kind of crazy with connection dropping, and it's other than that, I'm generally happy with it. And and I got it on a sale. I think I paid $80 for it. And when you look at a value proposition on something like that for what it does, I'm happy.
Yep, I would agree.
So, Adam, before we go, I really want you to just take a minute or two, as long as you want, and tell everyone where they can find the MacCast, any other shows you're on, or anything else you'd like to tell people about.
Sure. Thank you. You can find the MacCast on iTunes. Just search for MacCast. Also, MacCast.com is the website. MacCast is now actually on Spotify, too. I probably should mention that. So if you're a Spotify user, you can find MacCast in the show section on Spotify. And then a couple other shows that I do. If you're more of an iOS person, I do the iOS show with Jeff Gamet and Michael Johnston. So you can check that show out. And also, I'm a pretty regular guest on the Mac show, which is on the British Tech Network. It's more, I was going to say UK focused, but it's a roundtable. They call it like guys hanging out in the pub sort of conversation. So, not quite as clean as the MacCast, but we have a good time. It's like you're going to get kind of bar talk. Imagine a bunch of guys sitting around a bar talking about Apple and technology, and that's pretty much the show that you have there. But it's a lot of fun, so people should check that out. And then, of course, I'm on all the social medias, MacCast on Twitter, the MacCast on Facebook, and you can find me on Google Plus too. Although I mostly hang out on Twitter, so if you want to pick one social network to follow me on, I would say Twitter's the one.
Absolutely. I would fully agree with that. And Adam, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. This has been officially, in 41 episodes, the longest episode of the Podcast Digest. And really, I was compressing things. I could have gone so much longer. I can't thank you enough.
Sorry, I get talking, and that's the nature of being a podcaster.
It's been a privilege to be on the other end of this. It really has been. And folks, please check out the MacCast. All the links that Adam mentioned will be in the show notes for you. Click right there in your podcast app of choice. Subscribe right now, especially if you're an Apple fan or any interest in technology or Apple products. You will love the work that Adam does. That'll do it for this week for me, folks. My name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.